own brother with an axe. And things don't improve when they move to the city. The his father, Pandu's father, is always suspicious of the mother because she has to work all the time. The husband himself has tuberculosis and is weak, so he cannot do any work at all. So he drinks all the time like any typical unemployed man, and he is always suspicious and jealous of the wife because she is young and beautiful, and he would always see her in that suspicious light that she is trying to sell her body for material gains. And the after effects of that suspicion is he abuses her, he checks her bodies of any marks of infidelity, and all this happens sometimes in the presence of their son as well. So Pandu has grown in an environment of resentment, suspicion, and he himself learns to uh, resent the mother. In a particular incident, the father tries to uh, burn the mother's skin with and mark her with a tongue, and the mother in resentment asks her conjugal rights in order to hasten the husband's death, because of his tuberculosis he cannot do any strenuous activities. So I w- I guessed that she, in order to hasten his death, she asks for her conjugal rights, and eventually he dies, the husband, and 10 years later Pandu goes to school. Pandu goes to school, and even in his school, there are rumors around that Pandu's mother is a whore. She sells her body, and Pandu is always ridiculed, abused, attacked, bullied in the school. And all this resentment and hatred he keeps inside of him. And when he goes home, he dumps all of this resentment onto the mother. And in a particular incident, in another particular incident, that he shouts at her and he runs away from home. After a while, somebody comes and knocks on the door. So the mother, in expectations that her son has returned, opens the door. But instead of the son, there is a stranger there, and he tries to take advantages of her. And in her stupor, in her shock, she lets him do it. And for a moment, she feels appreciated, she feels alive, and she lets him do it whatever he wants. But after a moment, her son returns and sees whatever that is happening, and he shouts at her again, and this time with tears and more pronounced resentment, runs away from home again. And the mother comes back to herself and tries to get away from that situation, but it is already too late, and the story ends here. So, after the summary, Tharu denotes this uh, the structure of this story as it has kind of linguistic air. Um, I don't really understand what she says when she compares this structure of the story with that of the construct of Walter Benjamin's theory of linguistic air. But she says that the translation rises to a higher and purer linguistic air than the original, since a translation is concerned less with the transfer of meaning or transformation and more with essaying a mode of signification. So, what I understand by this concept is that the translation of this story is on a higher level than that the original was. And the reason for that is the signified, the signs are so close to what they refer. Tharu gives this explanation. The linguistic air of a translation draws attention to the signifying system that is another culture. So, in this world of Bagul's story, the sign and the referent are a natural fit. So, the language does not just thematize another process or mode of signification, but it provides a symbol uh, where logic is apparent everywhere. So, in this story, Tharu says that signification is materializing and dematerializing uh, force. So, the events, bodies, persons, objects, and selves are kind of a sign, and one needs to fully investigate what how they make sense and what they exactly mean. So according to Tharu, the bodies are so wavered that they must be branded. Tuberculosis is a caste mark, a markage of a caste. Memory an aspect of present time and public location. It rushes in from the word of habilitate, word to habilitate a personal past. So Tharu says that in this linguistic air, the bodies of the characters, I am assuming here that the bodies of the characters, especially that of the mother, is portrayed in a wayward light. That they must be branded, as um, in a particular incident where the husband tries to brand the body of uh, the widow, the mother, it signifies that in the husband's eyes, the body of the mother is so wayward that he must mark her as his own, his possession. It is what I assume. And further on, she says that in this story is continuously moving. It does not rest anywhere. It does not give time. It does not give a breather to the readers and the storytellers. So there are Tharu says that there are so many deaths in the story. Uh, Although there are not many deaths, actual realistic deaths in the story, only the death of the husband is depicted in the story, but death is very symbolic. So when Pandu is ridiculed because there is an image of his mother, that mother as a whore, and he says to everyone not to touch Pandu because of the deeds of his mother, supposedly the deeds of the mother. And in that particular moment, the image of the mother inside of the Pandu shatters. And for him, a mother is, it signifies the death of the mother. And as at the same time, because he is the son of that mother, it also signifies the death of a son. So there are so many deaths according to Tharu. And there is also another incident which is depicted, that there is a character named Dagdu. He is kind of a thug, and he physically abuses Pandu. And in order to withstand that kind of abuse, Pandu imagines certain scenarios where he, in his mind, kills Dagdu very violently. And these images are very vivid and violent, but they are all inside of Pandu's mind, and he cannot do anything to Dagdu because he is scared and he feels powerless. And somewhat he also feels that what they are doing to himself is somewhat justified, because uh, what his mother's image is in out in the society. So in that, he there is also death of the son, and the death of a student. um so in the next next portion, Tharu analyzes the husband as well. So she puts forward a kind of a theory about why the husband feels so jealous and suspicious of the mother. So she says that because the image of a man in a society is that of the provider of a family, and the husband here in this story cannot do anything. He always sits around and always sees his wife doing all the works and providing for the family. He feels emasculated by it, and in order to compensate that feeling of emasculation, he tries to regain the power by abusing the body of that woman. So his status as a husband, a man must erase those marks which are also the marks of his emasculation, his disposition, his dispossession, the impossibility of personhood. Pandu's father's blows, therefore, were always aimed at destroying his wife's full blown beauty. He hoped she would lose a lot of blood, become lame, deformed, ugly, and so, in spite of his ebbing strength, he would aim at her face, nose, head, eyes. Then he threatened to kill her when she was asleep. He blamed her entirely for his disease, his failing strength, his joblessness. And for similar reason, when in the start of the story, he would rather die himself and let the child let the child die than to look at his brother's able body and the way how his brother treats his wife, and in that kind of a humiliation he tries to kill his own brother. He sees her as the husband sees his brother as a kind of a mirror, a kind of a, an image of what he could have been if not for his disease. So that's what Tharu posits here.
Okay.
And in the yes, sir. In the last portion of this essay, in the third section, Tharu imagines a reader, and she is a feminist reader, a kind of a reader who is safely tucked into a shelter of a higher caste, and she reads this story about a Dalit woman, a Dalit widow, and it opens her views toward how deformed patriarchy can be. Um, and further, she also examines the concept of untouchability in this story. So Tharu says that Baburao Bagal does not refer particularly to this untouchability, but he also covers everything that comes with being an untouchable. So um, it is not the concept of untouchability does not come directly, but a character named Kishan yells out, "Don't touch Pandu, any of you." But the reason for not touching Pandu is not the same as what we would imagine. It is not as the Pandu is a Harijan, and that's why we should not touch him. That was not his reason to yell that out, but the reason was that Pandu's mother, the image of Pandu's mother is that she sells her body for material gain, and that she is a whore. So that is, and Pandu is her son. That's why we should not touch Pandu. Um, she also examines the uh, concepts of consent and subject, which I have some difficulty to understand. Um, why Tharu puts this concept and examines these concepts in this particular story. And to conclude, this Tharu says that if in modern Indian literature the choice of the widow as a protagonist should be read as an announcement that the text is an intervention in feminist theory, how might we describe the political theoretical moves that are being made by the text that we have been discussing? It seems to me that the stories represent two of the most powerful contesting forces within feminism today. On the one hand, the pressures of a re-empowered middle class whose fund bank aspirations are global and who must remake its humanism to suit. On the other hand, the questions raised by the Dalit movement, terrifying and full of promise. So Tharu says that in modern Indian literature, there are two extreme points of views describing feminism. On one hand, uh, the first story, which was of an upper caste, middle, upper middle class, I mean, upper caste and middle class woman of, uh, and she is portrayed as an old woman. She is a sort of a figure who uh, aspires to gain everything back which she lost in the course of her widowhood. And on the other hand, the struggles, the intolerable, hellish struggles that a Dalit woman is facing in Bagul's story. So yeah, that's all from me.
Questions, queries, doubts? Anyone?
Sir, actually, I have a few doubts about.
Okay.
So to start with, I would like understand this concept of linguistic error, the concept of Walter Benjamin, I suppose.
Okay. Anyone wants to say something about it? The idea of linguistic error in Walter Benjamin. You've studied Walter Benjamin, right? as part of your Marxism course?
Yes, but as a part of cultural studies,
Mm.
we studied reproduction, cultural reproduction, or something along the line.
Anyone else remembers what did you study about Walter Benjamin last year? I'm sorry, in culture studies. Others in the class, have you heard of Walter Benjamin? What does he say about culture studies? Yes, you studied it, right? So why is this silence? What essay did you study and what does he say?
That we start in mechanical reproduction.
Hmm. So what does he say?
Yes, yes. That we check the culture.
So what does he say in that?
I'm trying to.
Okay. Your voice is not very clear, Ripa. Anyone else remembers what did you study about Walter Benjamin?
So we studied his
Concept of aura.
Yes, Pooja, go ahead.
Yeah, go on.
yeah, we studied his essay, reproduction of art in mechanical age. So like I don't remember the full essay obviously, but what I remember ki we had discussions on how he talked about art being like art being transported into different mediums, and how these mediums were not as authentic or did not have the same aura as the originals. Yeah, and basically the most of the essay had its foundation in the authenticity and the aura of the original, which was kind of probably lost while it was being converted into a different medium.
Yeah, right. So when, say, for example, painting of Mona Lisa is, you find it as a meme, then the aura gets lost. Or when you see its print, then there is nothing very original about Mona Lisa when you go to see it in Louvre, right? It has already lost its aura, according to Walter Benjamin, right? But in
Yes,
case
sir.
of translation, he has made a very important statement, which we did touch upon when we were talking about emergence of translation studies. So there his name cropped up along with Ezra Pound. Does anyone remember that? What he has to say about translation? Do you remember just that his name cropped up in the question of translation? I'm not asking you what he said, because that we haven't discussed.
Yes, sir. There were like two
Yes.
people who actually talked about it in that essay, and that
Hmm.
one of the two people was Ezra Pound, the American, and the other was Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin was considered to have given some reasons which were more different, and I don't know, stood out differently than Ezra Pound.
I think, which essay did this talk about, Walter Benjamin?
Um, I think in the last unit, um, but,
Which essay?
1 second, so let me remember.
Others don't remember anything.
Sir, we discussed in unit, on the paper 11, core 11, unit 3, essay number 2
By
by sir, 1 second. Sir, by Mary Snell Hornby.
emergence of translation studies, right? And Pooja is talking about a different essay where again his name is mentioned in relation to Ezra Pound. So which essay are you talking about, Pooja? Does anyone remember?
Sir, I am talking about the same essay because like I remember that day you had meeting, but I forgot. I mixed it up with the core 12B. We had core 11 discussion and you were asking us questions and then you had some meeting. So you asked us to read the essay in the class itself. So that was the time when I read the essay in the class.
That was Lefebvre's essay, I guess.
Right. Okay. So here is what he says, right? And his theory has become extremely influential in those times. And he says something which is counterintuitive, very much like Ezra Pound. Walter Benjamin says that, again, going to the myth of Babel, Tower of Babel. You have heard this story from me, Tower of Babel. Does anyone remember?
Yes, sir. Dharti also shared this story, and you also told it afterwards.
So what is that story?
So it says that the story comes from Genesis, the Old Testament, and that once where all the humans were united, they tried to build a tower which would reach heavens, and the in God saw this as an act of insubordination and the act of defiance. So he struck this tower with his force, and the tower the tower was destroyed, the Tower of Babel, and in order to scatter the humans, in order to not let them be united again, he cursed the humans with different languages, so so that they don't unite and construct a tower once again in future.
So what united people, all people on the planet? Sorry.
The language.
Because they spoke a single language, they had this unity, and because of this unity, they had this hubris or arrogance to say that हम मरने से पहले direct स्वर्ग में जाना चाहते हैं. So it's like saying we'll build a metro from Baroda to heaven, right? एक flyover बना दे direct. So, and that kind of arrogance God does not obviously like, because you can reach, you are short circuiting 3 religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which says that you can go to heaven only after your death, right? So he destroys this unity and the tower as well by making people speak different languages, different tongues, so that people never unite. So it's the curse of Babel that has made people speak different languages. And so how is it relevant to translation, this whole myth, Christian myth of Babel?
So if we translate a text or anything from one language to another, then essentially we are trying to understand each other, and eventually we may even unite as one whole.
Okay. But
Ask the
Okay, anyone else? Yeah.
Can you ask your question again?
My question is, what is relevance of the story of Tower of Babel to translation?
So, sir, this story became the foundation of the thoughts that Western people had. Like, translation is seen as something which is not as good as the original. Like, since Bible was being translated into other language, so it would not be the language of the God or the as the original is supposed to be. If makes sense.
So what is this Tower of Babel has to do with question of translation of Babel and inferiority of translation?
Multilingualism, like since in that story there was like people now spoke different languages, so that was seen, like, and in the translation the same thing occurs. So there's like an equivalent of seeing it as a sin, like since it was not nice.
Right. So it is, so having multiplicity of language is a consequence of the curse of God, right? पाप किया है इंसान ने, तो उस पाप का उसका there is this curse of Babel that people speak different languages, and so translation is necessitated by this curse. So translation is not a good thing, but then it is necessary because of the curse of Babel. पाप का नतीजा है, पाप की औलाद है translation, right? So illegitimacy of translation is what is. So translation did not have a good press or did not have good status in the West. And one of the reasons for it is, as we have discussed, Platonic idealism, right? Which sees the world as a copy of the ideal world. So translation becomes copy of a copy of a copy, which is more inauthentic and derivative. At the same time, apart from this classical paradigm, Christian paradigm also sees translation as a consequence of the human sin and the wrath of God. So that also makes it have a negative connotations, right? And tampering with Bible, as Pooja rightly said, is seen as a act of heresy in itself, which is not a good idea. So the Christian dimensions of Western intellectual traditions are also, what should I say, are not in favor of translation, but translation is necessary kind of evil, right? And Platonicism dismisses it as derivative and inauthentic. And in the time of Romanticism, there is a kind of revival of Neoplatonic thought and the idea of genius, which again puts translation as an idea of labor. So because of these several dimensions of Western thought, translation is seen as something which is very negative, very derivative, lacking in its originality. So this kind of negative perspective of translation comes from the West, right? And Walter Benjamin's intervention is very interesting. He again alludes to this Tower of Babel. And he says that there was this single language of man, what he calls Ur language, Ur language, which all human beings spoke. And after all languages were produced, it became a kind of vessel, holy vessel that is broken into fragments. And he is evoking kind of Kabbalistic. Kabbalah is the mystical system of the Jews that he alludes to. So this breaking of the vessel and fragmentation, then all languages are kind of fragments, while the one language of man is like that one entire vessel. Now, when person translates, right, according to Benjamin, translator is lifting a text out of its context, fragmented context, and bringing it into the domain of this whole language of man, the Ur language. So he is taking it out of the existing linguistic air, Vatavaran, right? Air as Vatavaran in that sense, and bringing it into a kind of higher dimension of a transcendental dimension of unity, unified, lost language of man. And therefore, according to Benjamin, translation is a superior mode of existence compared to the original. And he also talks about this superior mode as afterlife of the text, right? So translation as afterlife is a superior mode of existence ontologically, because it takes translation, it takes the text out of its confines of fragmentary language and brings it into a transcendental realm of one language of man, right? And he compares that with what happens after your death, right? According to Abrahamic religion, and these three religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, are often called Abrahamic religions, right? Because they have similar mythological systems of belief. Not the same, but similar. But so what happens after life of man is that once you are dead, then according to your good deeds and bad deeds, how closely you have followed God's words, God will decide whether you should go to paradise or you should go to inferno. नर्क में जाओगे, दोजख में जाओगे, या स्वर्ग में जाओगे, right? फिरदौस में जाओगे. So it's decided by God. That is the Abrahamic eschatology. Eschatology means what happens to human beings after their death, right? So according to Christian, Judaic, and Islamic system, afterlife can be a good place to be or bad place to be, because it all depends on how you lived your life. So according to Benjamin, this afterlife of text, which the translation gives to the original, is a higher, superior mode of existence. It takes the text out of its linguistic air and makes it into a superior form of existence. Does that make any sense? He's saying translation is superior to original as a mode of existence.
And sir, by putting it out in this context of Bagul's story, Tharo is saying the same thing.
That translation has managed to take things out of the linguistic air, but it still gives you a sense of that air from which it has come. वो वातावरण जिसमें से ये कहानी आई है अंग्रेजी में. From the Dalit life, it has come into English, which is elite language, right? तो वो हवा दिखाई देती है, वो आबो हवा दिखाई देती है. If you want to more exact, precise meaning of linguistic air, वो आबो हवा है. You can get a glimpse of that. That's what she is saying. From where Dalit lives are lived, you can get a sense of it in English translation. Yeah, Vibha, you were asking something.
Yeah, so like I was asking why this concept of linguistic air was discussed in this context of Baburao Bagal.
Because Susie Tharo is trying to indicate that the world to which Baburao Bagul's story belongs is a kind of nether world, right? It's like Nark. It's very different from the well-made world of the middle class upper caste life. Look at page number 1996, right? So people who talk about India or Indian culture, or people who talk about Indian literature, talk about literature coming from a well-made upper caste world. But this world of Dalits is not a well-made world. It's violent, it's traumatic, it's dehumanizing, and it is extremely, what should I say, horrific, terrifying, compared to this well-made world to which whose story is it? Geeta Hariharan's story belongs. Right, so she compares these two stories, one written in English and one written in Marathi in English translation. Right, so she is bringing together Indian writing in English and Indian writing in English translation. And Susie Tharoux is suggesting that Indian literature and English translation, especially Dalit, gives a glimpse of that nether world, that Abo-Hawa, linguistic air from in which Dalits live. Right, though English is a very elite and well-made language, but you can get a glimpse of that nether world from that. That's why she has brought in these ideas of linguistic air into this. Does it help you to clarify?
Yes, sir. And
Yes.
another question on the same page. Uh, it is on the last column and about second paragraph, and in that it says that nothing holds, nothing stands still, nothing may be taken for granted. It is the symbolic that gives birth to subjects and tempts that dreams with agency, while it watches ceremoniously over their many and rapid deaths. A single
Where
death would
exactly are
it
you
be
talking about? Can you pinpoint it? Same page, but
Sir,
which
on the
last
last
column?
column and on the second paragraph and in the last bottom of that
Which
second
begins
paragraph.
with? Which begins with?
In this linguistic air, which is as much the air of real life.
I can't find it.
Sir, page number 1313.
1313, okay. Yeah. In this linguistic air, right? Okay.
So at the end of it, nothing holds, nothing stands. And what I want to know is that what does she mean by subjects and agency, dreams with agency, and does this concept of subjecthood, a subject as in the characters of the story, or subject as in subject of a nation and subject of a kingdom?
Anyone would like to comment upon this? What do you mean by subject in theory? You're all students of theory, right? What do you mean by subject?
So what I gained, I mean, what I understood from subject is that the subject of our analysis.
Okay. Subject of what you study. Okay. Any other meaning? But what do you mean by the term subject in theory? The theory में हम subject as a term use करते हैं. What do we mean by that? You have studied post-structuralism, structuralism, psychoanalysis, culture studies में आता है कि ये term subject?
Sir, subject as in the one who is acting, the one who is supposed to do the action.
Okay. What do you mean by subject in literary theory and criticism and culture studies? You have studied all these things. That's why I'm asking you. पहली बार तो नहीं सुन रहे हो ना?
So can it refer to just like an individual or like just an idea when we are talking about it in theories or cultural studies?
What do you mean by subject in cultural studies and post-structuralism and psychoanalysis में ये सब आप पढ़ते हो तब subject ये term आती नहीं है और have you ever not heard of it?
Sir, the subject means the one who is studying the object.
Okay. Is that what it means in post-structuralism? Or culture studies? What have you studied in culture studies में कहाँ तक हुआ है आपका? Literary theory और criticism में क्या हुआ है? See, you should be able to make connections across courses, right? Because though they are divided, it doesn't mean one is completely untouched with another. They talk to each other and share and ideas and differ from each other as well. So the terminology that Susie Theroux is using is of third wave feminism, post-structuralism, and culture studies. So the term subject is very important in that theoretical frame. So what do you mean by that? What do you imply when you use the word subject?
So the subject here is in this context is the widow, young widow.
Okay, I am asking you not in this context. I am asking you what does the term imply in culture studies and post-structuralism and literary theory and criticism. I'm asking all of you because you have studied all these things. Komal. Anybody? No one? See, I can tell you, but then, it will be spoon feeding. Especially when you're dealing with something that you are already studied. I'm not talking about anything new. Because Benjamin's idea of translations were not something that you have studied, I discussed it. But the terms subject is something that you have studied. So I'm not going to tell you that. I want you to find out and tell me. Think about, remember and tell me.
Sir.
Yeah.
Subject has a very various uses and subject does not have very clear definition.
Okay.
As far as I know. And in the context of the cultural studies, it is very diversified. And it's very debatable. We cannot give the clear definition of subject.
So what are various meanings of the term subject in culture studies and post-structuralism?
it's very non-unitary.
So what are those various meanings? I'm not saying what is the meaning of it. I'm asking what are various meanings of that term.
I mean, it's very hard to articulate.
Not so hard as well. The various meanings of the term subject, right? You are right when you say there are various and diverse meanings, but what are those meanings?
So, can subject mean something like a being which is in constant process of change?
Okay, being is not in constant process of change.
मतलब
Becoming is in the process of change. Okay. What else? Because
The
that,
So,
subject,
sir,
yeah.
the subject can be someone that has the agency to perform an action or to not perform an action. Then
Okay.
subject can, so there are few meanings that I can remember. So one is that, and then other is that we also come across the term subject with a capital S. So that is generally associated with the existence of God or the absolute. And then subject is something. So Sir King would generally address his countrymen as subject as well. So these are few definitions that I could remember of.
Right. Clear cut meaning. If it has got these kind of meanings, then why do people use it? What do they want to say, especially say for example in this context, the context of the story? In which sense is it used, Rushi?
sir, can you repeat the question?
My
My
question is
network.
if it is used in several senses, like a subject and king, subject and object, uh, then subject to be studied, and subject as a process of becoming, or subject as what else? Absolute subject, or subject and agency. If all these meanings are implied, in this context, what is implied?
In this context, the subject is female body, particularly
Okay.
in one point from in one portion, the female body is of a different caste, and in other portion of the essay, the female body is of the lower caste, lowest of the low
Okay.
caste.
So here is the question for you as homework. Right? Why is it homework? Because I am not teaching anything new. If you have not understood this, then you have not understood the subjects that you have studied. that is post-structuralism or culture studies, your understanding is questionable. Why do people use it at all in culture studies or post-structuralism if it does not have a clear-cut meaning? If it has got whole range of diverse meaning, as Vibha rightly points out, then why do people use it at all? What do they want to imply by using that term? So go back to your culture studies, post-structuralism, structuralism, psychoanalysis, Marxism, texts, feminism, जो अब तक पढ़ा है, right? And find out why is this term used at all, and what is it used in place of? किस word की जगह पे ये word use हुआ है और क्यों? You have to find these answers to these questions. Will you do that? I can teach you, but that would be spoon feeding, and I don't want to do that. Because spoon feeding से कुछ फायदा होने वाला नहीं. Will you tell me tomorrow? Because the whole crux of this essay, the core argument rests on these terms. That's why it's central to this essay.
Sir,
Yeah,
can you
My
give us
question.
like a no, sir? Can you give us a direction like where
I
to
have given
find
so many
this?
directions. In your post-structuralism, structuralism, Marxism, culture studies, feminism, gender studies, ये सब में subject आता है. Subject is one of the most important words used, and is used in place of which term and why is it used, ये आपको ढूंढ के लाना है. Will you do that? All of you willing to take, because it puts under question आपने क्या पढ़ा, इतने सारे कोर्सेज आपने पढ़े, उसमें से क्या समझे आप? If you're not able to answer this question clearly, it means that your understanding of all these things that I have said is limited and questionable. Psychoanalysis, Marxism, structuralism, post-structuralism, culture studies. ये 5 यूनिट्स जो आपने पढ़े, is that okay? That is the direction.
Yes, sir.
So tomorrow you will tell me why is this term used and how is it used, in place of what.
Okay, sir.
Okay, sir. Yeah. Okay, good. So we meet tomorrow then, right? With problems from this essay, or else we'll go on to the next essay. If you don't have difficulties from and I will also explain you how we are going to maybe have something of internal test. See, I don't know, nobody has told me how to go about having internal mid-sem test. So I was thinking of certain patterns and we will discuss that tomorrow, right? So if you have any doubt starting from unit 1 essay 1 to unit 3 essay 3, कुछ भी डाउट हो आपको, 3, 7, 10 ऐसे जो हमने पढ़े उसमें से कोई भी डाउट्स हो तो कल लेके आना, राइट? यस, नो?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right. So we meet tomorrow. We'll talk about how we are going to have mid-sem. At least that is my plan. But again, it depends on whether I am officially permitted to implement it, because that requires a written kind of thing. And if they say take only MCQ, तो ऐसे लेना पड़ेगा. But if it is left of me, I won't take MCQ. I will have open book test, right? And what kind be the question pattern, I will discuss tomorrow. And then if you don't have any other question, then we will start with the 4th essay. And who is going to make presentation on this? Constructions of world literature in colonial and post-colonial India.
Sir, it's I and Shohan.
Okay. So you be ready with that. And you can connect it with the essay on world literature that you have studied in core 11 as well, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So see you tomorrow then. Have a good day.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.